Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Gabrielle Fayant, the co-founder and helper with the Assembly of Seven Generations, an Indigenous-owned, grassroots youth-led nonprofit organization focused on cultural support and empowerment programs for Indigenous youth. The former Inspire Award recipient is Métis from the Fishing Lake Métis settlement in Alberta, who now describes herself as an auntie to the Utes. She has been working on Indigenous youth issues for more than a decade. Gabby, thanks so much for being with us this week.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
You, as we mentioned, are one of the co-creators of the Assembly of Seven Generations. Can you tell us a bit about what that is?
For sure. So Assembly of Seven Generations is also known as A7G for short, and we're a super grassroots Indigenous youth organization. We do all kinds of stuff. We have a Friday night drop-in. We like to do a lot of land-based activities. We also do a lot of crisis intervention to support youth and helping young people navigate different systems that really try to exclude them quite often. But yeah, we're really like low capacity just because we're grassroots, but we try our best and support a lot of young people in the local area within Ottawa, but also even wider than that. We also do a little bit of research and report writing because we believe that Indigenous youth should be the ones telling their own stories when it comes to research and reports. So we do a little bit of everything, and we also opened a store in the Byward Market as a social enterprise to support the work that we do.
Why did you feel that A7G was something that was needed in the first place?
That's a really good question. It's a bit of a long story, but I was also an Indigenous youth growing up in Ottawa in the city. And it was really, really hard. It was really hard to live in the city, like many other cities in Canada for Indigenous youth. And I was really inspired during Idle No More, during that winter, and it was like a spark was lit within me and many other young people across the country. And we started mobilizing and organizing, and we really wanted to create a platform for Indigenous youth to be able to tell their own stories and voice their own concerns. And so that's really how it started. We weren't really sure what it was going to look like. We just knew that there had to be something. And from there, it's been like an 8-year plus journey of figuring out how we can be supportive, how we can support youth, and what our role is, as well as a little bit of like learning not to extend ourselves too much. Mm-hmm. So that was like a hard lesson in it, because you want to support so many people, but you really have to work within your limits sometimes, which is the hard part.
What was it about Idle No More that set that spark for you?
Wow, I don't even know. I can't really narrow it down to one specific moment. There was just so many moments within a span of just a few months. There was many ceremonies that I had been a part of, many what some of my mentors and some of my peers would say like once-in-a-lifetime moments to experience, from like witnessing all the jingle dress dancers that came to Victoria Island, just seeing the commitment that Teresa Spence had during her hunger strike, and seeing all the community come together to support her during that time, and then to see all of the political movement that also happened, and how then it it just lit a spark. And then we also a year later had the Nishu walkers walk from Mox 2 to Ottawa. So it was just all like, it was just so many amazing things that I witnessed that really continues to drive me to this day.
As somebody who did this, how would you describe life for an Indigenous youth in an urban setting?
Yeah, it's really tough at times. Really different than, youth that are growing up in their communities, on the res or in the settlements. Really different, but definitely there's a lot of hardship that comes with it as well. Some of the experiences I've had as an Indigenous youth, growing up in Edmonton and then Ottawa, like I've been targeted by, men and just with not so great intentions. I often count my blessings that I wasn't just like scooped up or stolen, like so many of our peers. A lot of the MMIW G2S plus crisis, we don't really talk about how close it is to each one of us. And just growing up here in Ottawa, sometimes I'd be at just the corner store and a van would pull up and, try to solicit me for sex. And just in like a split moment, that man could have just grabbed me. But luckily there was always chances and I had luck, but our well-being and our safety shouldn't depend on luck.
One of the things that always stuck out with me, when I was in Thunder Bay, a lot of students had to come in from northern communities to go to high school there, and things as simple as, not even having a set of traffic lights in your community, and navigating that type of stuff out, buses. What are some of the issues that youth that you work with are dealing with in urban settings?
Yeah, so a lot of the current issues have to do with child welfare. Child welfare is a really, really big one. Indigenous youth continue to be targeted by that system. Poverty, really, really big one. Poverty and unemployment. And the really interesting thing that we've noticed is that there's actually a lot of young people that remain unemployed because they don't want to go into a toxic work environment, or like an unsafe work environment. So that's something we're witnessing. In Ottawa, we have a housing crisis, so constantly having to support folks navigating through housing and the lack of housing. So those are some of the big ones that come to the top of my head. Definitely mental health crisis. They definitely happen quite often, and there's very little to no support that a lot of the youth that we work with feel comfortable accessing.
In your years of doing this work, what have you seen that would help Indigenous youth thrive in urban settings?
Yeah, so for us, a really big thing that would help us would be the implementation of TRC Call to Action 66. And so this was some work that I started doing in 2017. And TRC Call to Action 66 talks about multi-year funding for Indigenous youth organizations. And one of the biggest struggles we have as a youth organization is the lack of funding. There's no sustainable funding, really. A lot of the funding is kind of like micro grants. And it's just, you can't sustain an organization and a community off of micro grants.
Gabby, do certainly want to talk about that work that you've been doing on that TRC recommendation and funding, the lack thereof. We're just going to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Gabrielle Fayant. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Gabrielle Fayant, the co-creator of a youth-led organization, the Assembly of Seven Generations. Gabby, before the break, we were talking about funding, more so a lack thereof. I guess, how do you do the work that you do with any funding that you have?
Yeah, so it's pretty challenging. There's a lot of demand, and the demand is so high because of that lack of funding and that lack of care that Indigenous youth really deserve. But I just kind of work off of, small contracts from time to time. A lot of the work I do is free labor, unfortunately. And it takes a really big toll on your mental health, your emotional well-being, and even your physical well-being. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Like, we're just kind of working off of, volunteers and community love, and a lot of free labor, a lot of just like small grants here and there.
What do you think A7G could achieve with stable funding?
Yeah, so this is something, we think about often, but I think some of the things that would help us with stable funding is, being able to plan at least a year in advance. Mm-hmm. One of the biggest challenges is that we have to do things like, in a week or like in 2 weeks, and that puts a huge stress on not only myself but like all the youth that are part of A7G. So definitely like planning ahead would be a huge one. Having the mental health supports in place would be very, very like life-changing, I think, for so many people. A lot of the youth don't, like I mentioned earlier, don't have access to mental health supports that they feel comfortable with. Another big thing that we really love doing is land-based activities. And, this has such a good overall impact on the community's health. So not just like the young people that are coming to the land-based activities, but also the broader community. So like their parents, their aunties, their grandparents and uncles. So it has a really great impact on mental health, physical health, and just a sense of belonging. So those are just a few. There's so many things I could mention, though. I think it would just really be like alleviating the stress and the burden that we're carrying. And during this time of reconciliation, it's so unfair that Indigenous youth have to carry the burden of healing through all this trauma that they didn't impose on themselves.
Yeah, politicians, other officials always speak of how important the Indigenous youth are. Well, why do you think it's so hard to even, line up stable funding for Indigenous youth organizations?
I think about this often, and I wish I had an answer. But if you really look at the history of colonization and systemic racism against Indigenous peoples, it's always been Indigenous youth that were the targets. From residential schools to the 60s scoop to current day child welfare, even police brutality and the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples. Many often are young people, are overrepresented in jails and prisons. And then when you look at the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girl, 2S+ crisis, it's a lot of young people. And so young people are often always targeted, and it's really confusing when we hear politicians and leaders talk about how the young people are the future, but yet there's no federal fund to support Indigenous youth at a grassroots level.
And you kind of touched on this before, but it does remind me of the work that you did a few years back in a story I did with you and Andre Bear a few years back. That work with Indigenous youth voices for the federal government to develop a roadmap for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission called Action 66. What was gained from that work?
Yeah, so some of the things that were gained from my perspective, you know, we had this really beautiful roadmap. It was probably one of the first times that we had this beautiful way forward that Indigenous youth created themselves. Over 500 Indigenous youth in many different forms contributed to that roadmap. So I think that was something that was really beautiful that we gained, and we gained a way forward. However, on the flip side, you know, those that have the power to create the change really didn't do much, and that report was shelved. And now we're kind of in this era where TRC 66 is turning into micro grants. And we're struggling, you know, and not just A7G, but there's many Indigenous youth groups that are doing similar work as us that are really struggling to meet the demands that Indigenous youth have.
That report was Indigenous led, like you say. It's sitting on a shelf as so many reports do. What was lost, not only for your organization, but for Indigenous youth right across the country here?
Yeah, it was a really hard hit to, you know, get our hopes up and then just have them fall. But, you know, we lost lives. We lost young people. And that's the seriousness of research and reports, and why we really believe that Indigenous youth have to be the ones leading this work, because far too often people are deciding things for Indigenous youth without their consent or without their input, and creating programs or policies that, you know, do the exact opposite of supporting Indigenous youth. So that was a really big impact, you know, and there's a bit of like survivor's guilt I find that a lot of us have that are working with youth on the ground. You know, we don't want to see our young ones, you know, be incarcerated or be lost to suicide. You know, we want to do everything we can to support them, but we just don't have the resources or the capacity to do all of that work.
Gabby, that report was about 4 or 5 years ago, but do you think it could be pulled off the shelf and put into place today?
Honestly, it's just sitting there waiting for the right political willpower to do the right thing. And in the meantime, we haven't given up. You know, we've continued to do reports. And so the next one we did right after that roadmap is we actually talked to Indigenous youth across the country about what ethical research and engagement looks like. And so they created 7 guiding principles. And then from there, we continue to do more research and reports in a really ethical and holistic and reciprocal way. You know, we haven't given up. We're still pushing forward, and recently we've actually met with several Indigenous youth groups from across Canada to create a bit of a strategy on how we can move forward. And so that'll be a really important report coming up. So stay tuned for that.
Absolutely. Looking forward to that. Gabby, more to talk about here. We've just got to step aside for one last quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation with Gabrielle Fayant here on Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Gabrielle Fayant, the co-founder of the Assembly of 7 Generations, among many other things, including a style blogger. Gabby, a couple of years ago, you and a friend started an Instagram page to help promote Indigenous brands, artists, and designers during the pandemic. Why was this something that you felt was needed?
Oh, I've been just a huge fan of Indigenous fashion for so long, and so I often would get compliments like, oh, where'd you get that dress? Or where'd you get those earrings? Where did you get this? And, so we felt like it would be so cool to kind of put it all together in one spot and just support these amazing Indigenous artists and brands that, make us feel so empowered and good about ourselves.
New York Fashion Week is almost upon us here. By the time this airs, it'll almost be wrapping up. A lot of Indigenous designers involved this time around. How exciting is that, and do you feel it's overdue?
Oh, yes, extremely overdue. I'm really, really excited about, all the opportunities that Indigenous designers are getting. I really love how Indigenous fashion has just been a part of our lives for generations and generations. It's really a very good example of slow fashion as well. And so, when you think about like those smoked beaded jackets that, our uncles or grandpas maybe used to rock, that's slow fashion. That's really, really slow fashion. And so a lot of our fashion gives back to the land and works with the land in a really holistic way. And so it's a lot of Indigenous fashion is eco-friendly. It supports Indigenous economy. It supports Indigenous beauty, and it's giving back to community as well.
What has fueled your passion for fashion?
I would say just seeing the beauty of it, and just like, for example, I'm wearing this Osamasquasis dress, and sometimes we're made to feel like we have to be really small. A lot of the systems around us, a lot of the colonial history around us kind of tells us to be small as Indigenous peoples, but, seeing these patterns and these colors, it gives you this hopeful feeling, it gives you happiness. I was tired of being small. I was tired of, pushing myself down. And I think that's what really gives me that passion for Indigenous fashion is, feeling proud and also just supporting these amazing folks.
Well, it's a stunning outfit you have on from what we can see here in Winnipeg for you in Ottawa. You're having your own fashion week. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so part of A7G, our social enterprise, is that we created a store here in the Byward Market in Ottawa. It's called Adawe Wagamig. It means a place of trade or selling in Anishinaabe. And that fashion show will be a part of the store and Winterlude. And so we're going to be showcasing Indigenous winter fashion. So, we'll have some capotes, some Métis capotes by Métis branded. We'll have some really awesome hats and gauntlets, and just showcasing, how beautiful we are. And a lot of the items will actually be for sale at our store afterwards. So it's really exciting. All the youth are really excited. They're all going to be models, and we really love to promote body positivity. So yeah, it's a really exciting time.
Awesome stuff, Gabby. We'll put a link to the store and the web story for this episode. We're out of time, but thanks so much for doing this week, Gabby.
Thanks for having me. Exemaga.
And that is all the time for this week. We will see you back here on Face to Face next Tuesday.